The Hyatt Regency Port of Spain and the Port of Spain Ballroom for the media conference on the conclusion of the two-day regional symposium, Violence is a Public Health Issue, the Crime Challenge, here in Trinidad and Tobago. Members of the media are present, and we thank those who have joined us for the media conference. The heads who have decided to be part of the media conference are at the podium at this time, and members of the media are also present. I turn over first to the host, Prime Minister Dr. Rowley, and of course the chair of CARICOM, should there be a need for remarks before the questions are fielded. Prime Minister.
Thank you very much. Members of the listening and viewing public, members of the media, thank you very much for joining us. I think we've said a lot to you, and at this opportunity we are ready to receive questions from you, and we hopefully will be able to give you some elucidating responses. So without further ado, I'd like to ask you to take advantage of the opportunity to place your questions. Please identify yourself and then place your question.
As soon as hello, good day. Ryan Hamilton Davis from the Trinidad Newsday. Well, first and foremost, really great two-day session. A lot came out of it, despite people saying otherwise. But one thing I did not notice over the two-day period was there wasn't a solid conversation in particular on corruption. And now this bears a lot of fruit, especially with the final declaration of a war on guns. All right, so I was wondering if you can speak to the role that corrupt officials, corrupt even politicians, corrupt businessmen, and how they add to the flow of firearms coming into the country. Thank you.
Well, I must say, it was mentioned, one person talked about the 3 C's and very pointedly made the point that there was a 4th C that was a major contributor, and that 4th C was identified as corruption. Well, we speak a lot about illegal entry, and we assume, and that assumption is still alive and well, that a lot of the illegal movement of these unwanted items, which are so dangerous to us, are facilitated by some element of corruption at various locations, too numerous to mention. The obvious one being at borders, and the others are facilitatory actions, and especially where guards who are supposed to guard the guards are in fact doing the opposite and facilitating, and we're familiar with that. So it's a given that for these things to flourish, there has to be some element of indifference or corruption.
Adding to just the corruption conversation, and then I have one more question going a little bit further. All right, has there been any level of evidence-based research or any kind of look into the level of corruption and the amount of corrupt bodies and how that has been affecting, the government and protective services' ability to fight crime and deal with crime? Has there been any assessment on that? And what has been the findings, if there has been anything like that?
Well, most of it is anecdotal, supported by continuous flows of evidence of actual things happening. And I think the best way to answer that is to say we know of no area of endeavor or activity, governmental or private sector, where corruption is not a possibility, likelihood, or widespread.
Prime Minister, if I might just jump in here. The purpose of the conference was to give us an opportunity to look at the institutional framework to treat with crime, and particular crime and violence, from a public health perspective. The public health perspective looks at both the symptoms, but it also looks deeply at what are some of the causes. And one of the causes, though it was not examined specifically and in depth, is the institutional strength of the region to deal with issues such as corruption. And it was addressed through the point of view that we need to strengthen our laws to treat with new and emerging crimes that our old laws did not contemplate. And so we are dealing with things now like cybercrime, for example. But we're also dealing with financial crimes. And we're also now dealing with a new type of criminal activity, the organized criminal activity, whose deliberate and sole purpose is a business model designed to weaken the state, to create space in which they can carry out their illicit activities. And in fact, that is one of the root causes of corruption. So indirectly, strengthening our legislative framework will treat with the matter of corruption, and in particular, dealing with these new and emerging criminal activities.
I just wanted to go...
If I may...
okay, give one of your colleagues a chance. We come back to you after, right? We can always come back to you if you have another question.
Good afternoon, everybody. Kijan Haynes, Guardian Media. I have two questions. Just one for clarification. Dr. Rowley, you said a ban on assault rifles. Can you give some clarification on what that means and how that differs from what we have now? You want the second question now? Or?
Let me take one at a time. As you may know, in Trinidad and Tobago, and similarly in other CARICOM territories, there may be little variations here and there. But let's take the Trinidad and Tobago model. We, over the decades, have always made firearms available at a relatively managed pace for civilians to have handguns for personal protection. And this had to be justified to the authorizing agency. And that was underpinned by a policy which said that we do not really want to arm the population to the extent where guns are commonplace and easily available for all the good reasons. And that situation changed recently, where, if you notice, there was one person who presented here who showed that the production and sale of handguns in the United States in recent times saw these heavier, more lethal and destructive assault weapons that are designed for military use for maximum destruction. Those weapons are now the weapons of choice. And the production levels are higher than the ones that have been accustomed to the handguns. And those weapons have begun to appear in our country. They are now commonly in the hands of criminals who get them through the legal trade, but they are also being licensed by the state into the hands of civilians. We are saying that we do not require those weapons within our society in a commonplace way because of the outcome of their presence in this society. So we can continue to provide personal protection with a certain amount of handguns in the population, and we are saying that having the volume of those guns in our community on a scale where easily available assault weapons can carry with it what we are seeing elsewhere, which are serious destructive outcomes. So while some people are fighting to roll back what they have done, we are saying let's not go there, because there is not a solution to our problem of safety and security. And that's what it meant.
Thank you for that. And this one is for anyone on the table. We're always looking for solutions. One of the things, there seems to be a lot of doom and gloom, everybody's saying, but I'm sure some CARICOM territories are doing better than others in terms of this scourge of violence. Which CARICOM country do you think is probably doing one of the better ones, and where we can learn, what examples can we learn from them and pass on to other colleagues?
Well, I would not say that we are doing better than the other. What I can say is that we do have a number of initiatives, which I could speak to. You would have heard the Commissioner of Police earlier in his presentation speak about what we call saturation patrol, where we have engaged in acquiring about 100 vehicles. They will be patrolling, particularly what they call hotspot areas, in a continuous 24-hour area, because what we have found is that where police are present, criminals tend to flee. And we have been, in a limited way, employing what we call saturation patrols. And when we go into one hot area, it appears that the criminals move to another area. So we're going to just flood our island with vehicles to have a more presence. And I think police presence is a deterrent, and it also assists in detection as well. We also have another program that we call the violence brokers, where we have identified former gang leaders, former gang members who are familiar and speak the language of other gang participants, and we engage them to speak to gang members or gang members to lay down their arms and try to broker any of the tensions that may exist between rival gangs. That has proven as well to be helpful. The Commissioner of Police spoke with me several weeks ago, and one of the things that we also find is that a number of the gang members are unemployed. And so we are about to initiate a program where we are going to engage them in work that they can do. For example, we'll take an area and have them clean up that area for 6 or 8 weeks, and just keep engaging them and keeping them busy, because I think, idle hands is the tool of the devil. And so if we can keep them busy, we think that is one of the other initiatives that we have started. And of course, through the Ministry of Education, they're looking now at making early interventions, particularly in our primary and junior high schools, where these young students are being recruited by gang members. So there are initiatives around protecting, in a way, these children from the influence of the gang recruiters. And so we're having after-school programs. We have a program called Urban Renewal. You may have seen it that involves the police. So after school, we have after-school programs like a marching band that has grown now to about 2,000 young people from 100 persons, just to keep them busy. I think that's one of the another initiative. That, along with after-school programs in literacy and numeracy.
I think, though, the characterization of doom and gloom may not be accurate. The truth is that governments are expressing through this symposium their concern and reflecting the alarm of their citizenry at the issue of crime and violence. But the fact that we are gathered here shows that the challenges are common across the region, and therefore there is opportunity for a regional collaboration to treat with the problem. And it has given us an opportunity to speak with one voice about the problem. In our different countries, we may tend to buy into the narrative of it is only happening here and therefore it's gloom and doom here, and not necessarily seeing the bigger picture, that there are some regional challenges that are cross-cutting. For example, the inflow of weapons, dangerous weapons, into our countries, where we don't produce them, we don't trade in them, but they're entering our islands and they're getting into the hands of our young men. It's not just young men in Trinidad, it's young men in Jamaica, in the Bahamas, and it's wreaking havoc on our families, on our schools, in our societies. The symposium, if it is broadcast regionally, if our regional population sees it, will help to change the mindset that it is all doom and gloom and the fatalistic outlook. The truth is that in the forum, we were also able to discuss and exchange solutions about what is happening in Trinidad, what we're doing in Jamaica, what we're doing in the Bahamas, and how we can learn from each other. So in that regard, I think we should take a more optimistic view of what the future could be for us to finally get a hold of the problem and to overcome the problem of violence and crime in our society.
Yeah. But I think that in every island, the problems are basically the same, but in different sizes, right? In St. Lucia, I would have liked to I like to think I was doing better, but suddenly I had an outburst. So I think we should learn from each other, and we should also try to get the responses from the whole of the society. And I want to speak specifically to the opposition, or the minority people, or the minority parties that believe that there's some gain by not encouraging, but at least criticizing. I think we need a whole of society approach, because you will get in government and the problems will be the same if together we not try to get some sort of solution. So I think this symposium was a learning experience and a gathering where you find some solutions, but you try to entice the entire society, everybody, civil society, churches, families, everybody to get together to fight a scourge that at all levels in the region is affecting us.
And I think on that note, I'd like to just raise up the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, Keith Rowley, for organizing this symposium and showing the leadership that is required to bring results and effectiveness to this issue. And I think we ought not to overlook that. And if there's one thing that our peoples in our respective member states should take from this, is the fact that we are here, that we are serious, that we have political will may have been waning, it is now restored, and that there's hope. The hope that Dr. David Allen spoke about when he gave his presentation to psychiatrists from the Bahamas. And so it's not doom and gloom. The challenges appear to be daunting. But I don't think we took this job on as leaders to shirk our responsibilities from tackling the challenges that face us. And I think this symposium demonstrated that. And I again want to thank Prime Minister Rowley for allowing us to be able to come and demonstrate our own personal commitment to this fight in respect to the scourge of crime that's impacting our region, and particularly to recognize it as a public health issue so that we could diagnose it, identify all of the specific ills that inform that health issue, and get the prescription drugs that is necessary to heal those illnesses.
Good afternoon, Prime Ministers. Peter Richards, Caribbean Media Corporation, Barbados. Given the fact that, Ms. Dr. Rowley, you spoke of the possibility of the regional attorneys general meeting to sort of harmonize legislation. Given the CARICOM's record on the implementation deficit, how optimistic are you about when the CARICOM, the attorneys generals meet and agree on some form of legislation? How soon or how optimistic are you of these pieces of legislation being implemented? And secondly, I want to ask, Dr. Gonzalez spoke about implementing the death penalty regardless of whether or not Europe would provide aid. Given that most of us in the Caribbean are dependent on aid one way or the other, especially from the European Union, are we prepared, as a matter of fact, of dealing with the violence and crime and what have you, to restart, some people would say, or to implement the death penalty? Thank you.
Well, firstly, let me address the part on the pace at which things can be done. I know it is frequently said that things take a long time or don't ever get done in CARICOM, and we keep repeating, but we did get a lot done since CARICOM has been formed. So it is possible to get some things done. Nowadays, what we have found is that the use of virtual meetings can facilitate the speed at which decisions are made. We don't have to travel to a meeting and make plans well in advance to spend 2-3 days for a one-day meeting. It's easier now for the attorneys general to have virtual meetings and advance issues. So we are anticipating that that will facilitate a faster flow. More importantly is the decision by the heads as to what aspects of the legislation that we are going to focus on from time to time to get done, whether it's amendments or creation of new legislation. That is the part that will take some time, and we trust that the relationship that we have now and the frequency with which we can and do meet now will allow us to do things a bit faster. So I am optimistic that that can be done. And I also say that the attorneys general that I'm familiar with now, some of them you've seen here in this meeting, they have an enthusiasm for giving some priority. And the issue itself is so serious, and I think the attorneys general grasp that we need to give it the time it deserves. And the other point you raised was the death penalty. That's a whole day discussion, because it's full of history, colonialism, and personal feeling. If you're asking me my personal view on the death penalty, I would tell you that I view the death penalty as a punishment, first and foremost, and not a deterrent. It might have a deterrent effect by being a punishment, but when you are guilty of murder, the penalty in the law, it's called penalty, is death. We have worked ourselves to a position where operationally it is very difficult to get to a stage where you can carry out the death penalty. So if you observe in my government in Trinidad and Tobago, we did not spend much time looking at the death penalty as an avenue for dealing with crime and frightening people away from crime, because we know what that means in terms of jumping through hoops. We are subject to another culture where the death penalty in the United Kingdom is anathema. And going there and coming back, especially knowing that every single person who is convicted and for whom the penalty is death, they have an automatic appeal to the Privy Council. And if you're fighting that, what you're really fighting is $1 million or $2 or $5 or $10 million expense, which hardly will bring you success. Every single person on death row is going to cost the taxpayer millions of dollars as that person is fighting for his or her life. That is what the death penalty means in our situation. And the question is, how much of that fight are you prepared to take? as the government that I led, we have the law there, it's still on the books, and it's still open to the population to determine what we do about it. But there are other things that we can do and must do, and we pay more attention to those things. But if the opportunity arises for the death penalty to be carried out, I am not one of those people who say that it is inhumane. What is inhumane is what is happening to innocent people by the criminal machine of the profit-making empire of those who profit from crime.
Good afternoon, Joshua Simongo from Guardian Media. I just have two questions. Firstly, to all the leaders at the podium, is there a realistic expectation that the United States government will step in and intervene and try and address this issue of guns flowing into our Caribbean when there is a widely acknowledged gun control crisis in the United States? And some would say the United States government can't even control keeping guns out of their classrooms. Is there a realistic expectation that the United States government will, in fact, put this in place, or is it more of a symbolic appeal to the United States?
Well, let me get this clear. We are not here taking on a fight with the United States government or the United States. We are taking the fight to gun manufacturers who at this time are protected by United States laws. I don't know that that will always be so for all times, but it does not prevent us from making a claim and from complaining that gun manufacturers, the products that they are producing are ending up in our territories and killing us. The same kind of fight we can take to those who produce medicine, those who design motor cars. There's a moral requirement that the product that you sell, you must know what the product is being used for. That is what this argument is about. And this is not the United States government. As a matter of fact, Ambassador just reminded me that the United States government itself is raising this argument in the United States. But the issue is with gun manufacturers who are selling a product for which there is an appetite increasing and encouraged for reasons of profiteering.
I think your question is an appropriate question. But my response would be that if we do nothing, then nothing will happen. If we accept the situation as it is, then the realistic outcome is that guns will continue to flow. It is by starting an action, it is by putting the situation to the United States, whether through legal channels, diplomatic channels, bilateral channels, by joining together, as we have done, to bring attention to the problem, that we will change the narrative, change the outlook, change the perspectives. So at present, it may seem an unrealistic expectation, but if we continue to lobby, if we continue through the legal channels, if we continue through the diplomatic channels, change can come. And we have seen this happen in many instances. When the tobacco lobby started, it would have seemed an impossible task to change the narrative and the legal perspective on something that was harmful to the general population, but it happened. So I think the real question should be, do we have the stick-to-itiveness to stay with this initiative and push for change?
Yeah. And finally, there's one other point that needs to be addressed, and starting with the question you asked, which is, what can the United States government do in this situation? And there are things the government can do. Yeah. And there are things we'll ask the US government to do. For example, help us fund border protection. Help us with training. Help us with information gathering, information sharing. Who are the gun runners? Help us to identify the source of the equipment. Or if we do interdict people here, help us with tracing. break down the trafficking of the items. So these are things that the government can do within the objective of trying to prevent people who are engaged in the criminality to not be successful in their endeavor.
If I may add, there's a two-pronged approach here. One is a legal approach, which is directed at the gun manufacturers, as Prime Minister Rowley has pointed out. And the other is that is pointed out by Prime Minister Holness, and that is the lobbying aspect of it, where we have been lending our voices to the cry of us being a victim of the trafficking of guns in our territory. And that is directly related to the government of the United States. And we have been calling upon them to do more. So, for example, in my case, I've made representation to the highest level. And what they have done for me, they have added, they have attached an agent to my gun task force division. I think he's in the alcohol and tobacco unit. He's there. So they assist in us tracing the guns from where it's purchased, identifying the purchasers, and in that instance, that is where they could help further. Now, since representations have been made in recent times, since June of last year, since the summit, a piece of legislation was passed to prevent, I think, to identify the straw purchasers and the ghost guns, to restrict those sort of purchases. I think more could be done in respect to once a purchaser in the United States is identified, and it could be shown that purchaser would have purchased, say, 40 guns within the space of 1 month, which we have evidence of in many instances. And that gun is used in the Bahamas. In some instances, 2 days, a week after it was purchased in the United States. Well, the government, the United States government could do something about that. They ought to make that person responsible. That person's right to bear arms has then been converted, in our view, to a right to traffic in arms. And that cannot be right. And as you quite rightly pointed out, the definition of the right to bear arms in the United States is a raging debate in the United States. We don't intend to get involved in that. That's an internal issue for them. But at the same time, we do highlight the fact that their right to bear those arms, to acquire those arms, ought not to give them the right to traffic in it. And so when we find it in our jurisdiction being used in violent crimes, that purchaser ought to be held accountable in some form or fashion. That's what they could do, and that's what we are continuing to press.
It even goes down to shipping, where a simple matter, like a shipper shipping a barrel, without a certain amount of intervention, a fake shipper can ship a barrel from the diaspora in the United States to a receiver in Trinidad and Tobago. And if there's no requirement for the shipper to identify him or herself, that's a major loophole. Because in the United States, in some states, anybody can go and purchase firearms and ammunition intending for use in the United States, puts it in a barrel, ship it without identifying him or herself as the shipper. It gets to Trinidad and Tobago to a consignee who is usually sometimes a fake person or a front for the real importer. So we need governmental cooperation to block these loopholes to prevent that kind of highway from existing.
And I think also it will bring some level of awareness as to the problem. Because we may have to take it from that point where you did it with and deal at the political level. So possibly it may mean that we probably have to write people at the political level to inform them, to make them aware of the magnitude of the problem, because we do not produce guns in any of the islands. And it's proven that most of the guns come from outside. So that document will raise the level of awareness to tell people, listen to me, there is a problem, and that problem is coming from outside, which is impacting on us internally. So I think the level of awareness will be raised.
And just the second question, I know some of the leaders acknowledge that there's room for legislative changes to help with this fight on crime. Were there any discussions particularly about campaign finance reform? Because there's a public perception, as a journalist, you go into many communities, especially some of the hotspot communities, and there's a sort of perception that some political parties, I'm not naming any or anything, across the region, or certain politicians are in bed with these sort of nameless, faceless financiers of political parties and so forth. And they might be, in other words, there's this sort of interlinked connection between these nameless, faceless financiers who may be involved in crime, but because of their connections with the politicians or people of certain statuses in society, they are deemed untouchable. So there's this perception, there's this position by some academics that campaign finance reform may help sort of remove or distance that connection between the alleged criminal masterminds who may be political financiers.
No, there was no discussion on campaign finance reform throughout this 2-day period. Maybe we didn't get there because we were so far away from it. But there's some element of interest there and truth of what you're saying, that persons who are involved or who are supportive of political opportunity could be implicated, but much of that is anecdotal and a lot of it is sensational. I have not seen a lot of evidence or significant evidence to support that criminals are running political parties in the region. But given how campaigns go in open democratic societies where anybody could participate, it is quite possible that persons who are engaged in criminality can also have preferences in the political arena and can provide support for candidates. But the extent to which that is a deciding factor, the jury is still out on that. Andrew, you want to take that?
No, in Jamaica, we have put in place campaign financing legislation. We had a historical problem, and I believe that in the last decade or so, we have managed to overcome that problem significantly. I think the effort now is mostly on ensuring that we have enough strong legislation to deal with money laundering, illicit wealth, and to ensure that our financial system and banking system is compliant with the international rules and obligations. And I think we have come a far way with that. I think all the CARICOM countries are themselves going through that process of strengthening our international financial rules and obligations. And that, I think, will largely ensure that our political actors are separate and insulated from the bad actors in our society.
We are currently, at the level of the government, considering the Jamaican model, because if it's acceptable in Jamaica, we believe it's reasonable and acceptable in a Commonwealth country like ours. And we also have made a lot of laws with respect to what Prime Minister Holness has said, have them implemented, explain your wealth.
Unexplained wealth.
FATF and all of
we are compliant with FATF. We, on the EU side as well, the matters of follow the money, where we've created laws to allow you to get orders in finding out certain things. Of course, you see some of it being challenged by certain persons now. We've created an FIU for that purpose to give. So we have to keep inventing new legislative tools to treat with the kinds of problems that have emerged in recent times. But those things are not going unchallenged But with a persistence and a commitment to get them done, Jamaica is a little ahead of us in some of it, and I think we are a little ahead of you in some of that. And so we're all engaged. And I expect that sometime in the not too distant future, that Trinidad and Tobago would enact new campaign finance, because we do have campaign finance legislation. I mean, you're supposed to report that you spend $60,000 in the election campaign, you know. But we have to have new legislation that makes that not the basis on which you report, and also to identify participation so that bad actors cannot control the process.
Good afternoon, Peter Christopher from Guardian Media. My question is to the Prime Minister, Dr. Rowley. Over the past 6 years, we've constantly seen a decrease in the national security allocation, with the exception of last year, I believe. Following this conference, is the consideration that we might see greater allocation into national security in the upcoming budget?
It's amazing how only certain aspects grab the eye. I'm sure you didn't see the year when we spent $10 billion on national security. What has happened is that the overall budgetary process in Trinidad and Tobago has been one of reductions. You would have remembered that in 2015, the budget was $60 billion, and a revenue stream that supported that in the order of 50-odd billion. The following year, the revenue stream was 34 billion, and we held the budget in the order of another 13 billion of borrowed money. And since then to now, even with a little spark last year, 2022, of higher oil and gas prices, we have been, in fact, dealing with significant revenue reductions in the budgeting process in Trinidad and Tobago. Is the CJ still here? Don't tell him I mentioned this. But in that scenario, where the judiciary took the position that in this era of budgetary reductions, doesn't matter what the reason is, the judiciary cannot face a cut in, and I got I think it was a 6-page letter from the Chief Justice, that the judiciary cannot face any reduction in its expenditure. And the government had to say, we think that the judiciary is a part of Trinidad and Tobago. And the budgetary circumstances and realities are that our revenues are just not there to support the level of expenditure that we have become accustomed to. So everybody had been having some reductions. And if you look at the 2023 and 2022, you will see the budget for national security at $6 or $7 billion. Oh, and down in policing is down at 3 or 3.4 billion. But what you would not link to that is just before that, there were huge expense in national security. And then that $10 billion covered some ongoing forward expenditure. So we couldn't possibly maintain that $10 billion a year in national security. But national security is not just the police. We have expensive equipment in the Coast Guard. We have costs outside of the police. You have the prisons, you have the fire services. When you add them all together, that's national security. So when I spoke only about the policing expenditure. And all aspects of government, barring few, I think health might be one of the few areas where we have not been, when we have not made significant reductions. I think health is a growing area, if I'm not mistaken. We have been spending more money on health. As again, you would understand, we're still in the end of COVID. 2020 and 2021, the expenditure in health was abnormally high. And education has not been equivalently reduced and so on. So it has been an era of careful management in that kind of circumstance.
And Prime Minister Mia Mottley would have raised several issues yesterday in terms of a regional forensic center, regional collaboration in terms of customs and policing. are we any closer to actually having something of a regional security force which might be able to patrol borders, whether by sea or by air? Are we any closer to that? And a follow-up to my earlier question, you've raised the issue of opposition earlier, Prime Minister Pierre. Do you need opposition support to pass any of these measures, especially the assault rifle ban? Do you need opposition support for that? So are we any closer to any sort of regional police force, security force? And do you need opposition support to pass anything that you want to pass?
Well, in my case, I have a 15-2 majority, so I don't really need opposition support in the House. I will. In the House, no. But for goodwill and to cause a whole of society approach, I would like to have the support. And I hope that good sense prevails, and if something so has to happen, it will. But I can't speak for them, because in case of the CCJ, when Senator was becoming a member of the CCJ, we did that late last year, we did not get the support of the opposition. So I can't speak for them, but I'd hope that if that happens, they would join us.
The other part of the question about the regional security force, we are not anywhere close to a West India Regiment type arrangement, a regional security force, but we do have something called the RSS, which is the Regional Security Service, which provides a service and a system, which, for example, it got Prime Minister Mitchell from Grenada got here by the intervention of the RSS. One time he had to come here and he had to go to Miami to get a flight to come to Trinidad, that kind of problem. But we do have some deeper cooperation, but we do maintain our national defense forces, Jamaica, Barbados, Antigua, so on, and there are, in fact, collaboration under the heads of government arrangements, and that's as much as we do in security. But there are other areas where we're making some considerable progress. For example, one area that we are working on, which is registration of companies. We are working towards a single CARICOM register, where any company registered anywhere in CARICOM is deemed to be registered in every other company. So we're working on that. That will take away the bureaucracy of a Jamaican company coming to Trinidad and a Trinidad company going to the Bahamas and being a Trinidad company in Bahamas. When we get there, that will be a significant facilitator of investment movement within the region. And Prime Minister Motley, who is the cabinet head on finance, we're working towards closer collaboration in the whole question of development financing, and we move as a region. So there are some areas, as we have, education, we have the CXC examination that is now commonplace. So we do have much more than West Indies cricket.
But just to be clear, though, as it relates to crime and violence as a public health threat and what we can do regionally, forensic in today's world plays a critical role in solving crime and bringing perpetrators to justice. But it is a very capital intensive and a very expensive undertaking to be done at scale and efficiently. And it is probably best done joined up together as a region. So out of this conference, the heads are more inclined to think in this way as it relates to developing regional capacity for forensic. That will help significantly. And then there is the whole issue of utilizing the tremendous capabilities that we have in our judiciary, in making our judiciary available regionally to help in the trial of cases in terms of cross-border within the region. So those would help.
Okay, thank you all very much, and hope that you found Monday and Tuesday very useful and we look forward to you helping the population understand what you've been trying to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prime Ministers. Thank you all, members of the media. Thank you so very much for facilitating. And for our live viewers, thank you for joining us. And do enjoy the rest of your afternoon and evening. Goodbye.